On one hand, you've got fighter jets that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. On the other, small firearms churned out in a workshop for practically nothing. They're both part of the same thing, the global arms industry. It's this huge, often shadowy world, and today we're going to pull back the curtain. We'll look at who's building these weapons, who's buying them, and how it's all changing the very idea of security, from the Caribbean all the way down to South America. So, first things first, let's just get a sense of the scale here. We're not talking about some niche market. This is a multi-trillion-dollar global ecosystem. The money flowing through this system, well, it shapes politics, it fuels conflicts, and it basically decides who holds the power. It's like this invisible web connecting factories to governments to battlefields all across the planet. And what's really fascinating is that inside this huge market, you've basically got two completely different worlds competing. You've got the titans, the big legacy players like the US and Russia, known for their super advanced, super expensive weapons. But then you've got this new wave of disruptors, places like Turkey, China, and India, and they're flooding the market with weapons that are cheap, they work, and just about anyone can get their hands on them. So let's dive into that second world first, the budget arms bazaar. Because this is where the old rules of the game are being completely rewritten, and it's absolutely key to understanding where global conflict is headed. And what's so smart about this is that each of these new players has found its own sweet spot. Turkey, for instance, has become a go-to for affordable shotguns and pistols. China is pumping out low-cost rifles and drones, and often they don't ask a lot of political questions. And India? India is quickly becoming one of the most important suppliers of cheap ammunition on the planet. To really get how much of a game changer this is, just look at that ammo. An Indian-made 155mm artillery shell, a really critical piece of military hardware, costs just $300. For what it is, that price is, well, it's almost hard to believe. I mean, think about that. That $300 shell, it costs less than a tenth of what you'd pay for the Western version. A price difference that massive doesn't just save a country money, it completely changes the global supply chain. It suddenly opens the door for nations with smaller budgets, or even those under sanctions, to arm themselves in ways they never could before. All right, so we have this two-tiered market. But how does that actually affect countries on the ground? Well, for that, let's head down to the Americas, where you can see these global trends playing out in really different ways. You've got a nation like Trinidad and Tobago, which is taking a very traditional, by-the-book approach to its security through official government channels. And then you have the rest of Latin America, which is a whole other story. It's this chaotic mix of huge state budgets, a private arms market that's just exploding, and of course, very powerful criminal groups. So since Trinidad and Tobago doesn't really have its own arms industry, its playbook is simple: invest and import. The government spends a lot on security, buying everything from new police cars to Coast Guard ships from its international partners. And for things like ammunition, they rely on suppliers like the Czech Republic to keep them stocked up. Okay, now let's jump over to South America, where the spending is just on another planet. The regional giant Brazil is at the top with a defense budget over $26 billion. But what's also really striking is that countries like Venezuela and Cuba, even while facing pretty severe economic problems, are still prioritizing military spending, sinking billions into defense. And yeah, this chart really drives that point home. The sheer scale of what Brazil is spending is just staggering. It completely dwarfs its neighbors, which really cements its role as the top military power in the region. This right here is that high-end, state-level arms market in full swing. But while governments are busy spending billions on jets and tanks, there's a whole different kind of arms race happening down on the street level. And for that story, we have to go to Ecuador. So Ecuador is facing a really brutal security crisis, driven by organized crime. In 2023, they did something drastic. They lifted a 14-year-old ban on civilian gun permits. The result? The floodgates just opened. You see a $7.4 million surge in private weapon imports. And these aren't for the military. This is almost all going to the country's booming private security sector. And right here is where our two stories collide. You see, Brazil is the only supplier of revolvers to Ecuador's private market, but who's the dominant player for semi-automatic pistols? Turkey. That's right, one of those key disruptors from the budget arms bazaar is now directly fueling this private security boom. And this brings us to a huge, critical vulnerability in this whole system. What happens when this massive wave of legal, privately owned weapons starts to, well, leak into the wrong hands? So how does a legal weapon just end up on the black market? Well, the Organization of American States points to this dangerous three-step pathway. It all starts with weak government controls over these private security companies. That's made worse by a flawed licensing system with basically no accountability. And it all ends with weapons simply disappearing, stolen or lost, with no one ever reporting it. And look, this isn't just a guess. A 2025 report from the OAS says it bluntly, quote, "Weapons diversion from private companies constitutes a recurring problem across the region." What that really means is that the private security sector has become an unintentional but incredibly effective pipeline straight to the black market. So, what does all this add up to? Well, we're facing a new global reality, one where there's this massive, ever-expanding arsenal of weapons out there, available through more backdoors and loopholes than ever before. In the end, these two worlds are just on a collision course. You have the official, high-tech world of state militaries with their billion-dollar budgets, and then, running right alongside it, you've got this booming, low-cost private market that is poorly regulated and incredibly easy for criminals to exploit. The friction between those two worlds, that's what's defining the security challenges of our time. Which leaves us with one final and pretty sobering question. In a world where weapons are getting cheaper and more plentiful every single day, available to both governments and private citizens, what is the true price of security?